The neighbor's kid kept drawing pictures of me, doing things I hadn't done yet. I realized something was wrong when the neighbor's kid handed me a crayon drawing of myself wearing the shirt I hadn't bought yet and standing in the street I'd never been to, holding a blue umbrella I didn't own, while a red car spun toward me in a spray of rain. "This is you," he said cheerfully, like he'd drawn a puppy. He was 6, maybe 7, with grass-stained knees and a cowlick that never obeyed gravity, and he stood on my porch grinning as if he hadn't just reached through time and pinched my spine. I laughed it off because that's what you do with kids' drawings. You smile, you praise the colors, you tape them to the fridge and let the paper curl at the corners until it becomes part of the kitchen. But the drawing went into my backpack instead of the fridge, and for the next few hours I carried it to the grocery store like a private superstition. At aisle 7, I saw the shirt. Same mustard color, same simple pocket. I stared at it the way you stare at a word you've spelled so often it stops looking real. Mustard isn't my color. I buy black, navy, things that pretend not to exist. Still, I took the shirt to the register, because I wanted to prove the drawing wasn't anything, just a coincidence I could break by making it too literal to be magic. The cashier said nice shirt and I said thanks and put it in the bag like I was hiding contraband. It rained that night, out of nowhere, the kind that begins as a whisper and turns into an argument with the sky, and I walked to my car with the grocery bag crinkling under my arm, and halfway there an umbrella seller stood on the corner under a pop-up tent, $3 each, cash only, and the one my hand reached for was blue. I told myself I chose blue because it would look stupid with the mustard shirt, and that stupidity would prove I had agency, and then a red car fishtailed at the far end of the block when it hit a pothole swallowing half the street, and the driver recovered and no one spun toward me and the world went quiet again except for my pulse. I told myself it wasn't the drawing. Meanwhile the drawing burned a hole in my bag. The kid lives 2 doors down with his mom and an older sister who has perfected the teen art of contempt. The mom works nights at the ER and leaves Tupperwares labeled with masking tape and instructions like heat 2 minutes, stir, don't eat on the couch. Their lives exist in tidy rings around my own messy 1-bedroom, and I wave when I take out the trash and sometimes bring in their packages when it rains. I didn't know the kid could draw. 2 days later he handed me another picture. This time I was sitting on a bus bench I never sit on with a coffee cup I never buy because I make coffee at home, and beside me there was a woman in a yellow scarf whose face was carefully smudged like he tried to draw her and thought better of it. "Tomorrow," he said, and he ran off before I could say thanks. I told myself his mom probably said it was sweet to draw people that kids latch onto patterns like barnacles. But the next morning my power blinked out because the building's ancient breaker tripped, and I was late enough that I skipped my home coffee and ran to the bus, and the bench was wet so I stood, and then I sat because my legs got tired, and a woman in a yellow scarf sat down beside me and looked right at me like she recognized me from somewhere she couldn't place. I didn't speak to her shy, stupid, pick your word, so when my bus arrived and hers didn't, I stepped on and watched that scarf turn into a bright comet in the rain. That evening the kid was waiting on my porch with another drawing clutched in both hands, and this one made my stomach drop. It was me at my kitchen table, my phone face up showing a notification from a number I don't have saved, and on the phone screen in ballpoint ink he'd written exactly 2 words, "Don't answer." The drawing included details too specific to ignore: my chipped mug with the crack that spiderwebs out from the handle, the burn mark on the table shaped like a map of Italy, the crooked blind that never sits right. I stepped around him, unlocked my door, and walked in already bristling at coincidences, and my phone buzzed on cue with an unknown number. The name field was blank. I stared at it long enough for the call to end and then it buzzed again and this time a text arrived, 1 word, my name, and a second later, "You don't know me but you will." I didn't answer. The kid peered around my leg as if checking his own accuracy and nodded, satisfied. "You didn't answer," he said. "Good. Why are you drawing me?" I asked, too sharply, and his face did that small collapsed kids' faces do when adults forget to soften their voices. "Because you asked me to," he said after a second, small and logical, like he was explaining weather. "When?" I asked, heart stuttering. "Later," he said, as if that settled it. "You said it would help." I crouched so we were eye level, even though eye level with a 6-year-old did not make the physics of the conversation feel less impossible. "Bud," I said carefully, "have we talked about this before?" He thought so hard his tongue poked out between his teeth. "Maybe," he said. "You were wearing the gray hoodie. You were sad." "I have 3 gray hoodies. I am often sad." It didn't help. That night I taped the drawings to the wall like evidence, and the faces he hadn't finished, the woman in the yellow scarf, the hint of a man leaning in a doorway behind my kitchen table, looked like fog about to remember how to be a storm. I didn't sleep. The next day the kid wasn't waiting on my porch, and I told myself I was relieved. I skipped the bus, made coffee I didn't drink, checked my phone 3 times while pretending I didn't want it to ring. At lunch, the unknown number texted again, "Coffee at 4, and I typed "Who is this?" and deleted it and typed "New number," and deleted that and finally typed nothing at all and locked the screen like that could lock the future. At 3:53 the kid appeared with another drawing. He'd drawn my apartment door open, and me standing inside holding my keys, and across the hall the empty unit 415 had a light on that never turns on because no one's rented it in months, and in the doorway of 415 there was the faint outline of a figure, all erased lines and hesitation, as if he tried to draw someone who kept moving. "When does this happen?" I asked, voice dry. He checked the invisible watch on his wrist with grave theatricality. "Soon," he said. "You told me to hurry." "I told you?" He shrugged like grown-ups are impossible. "You said please." At 4:01, keys in hand because drawings have made me superstitious, I heard footsteps in the hall and the soft scrape of a key in a lock that should have no lock to scrape. I opened my door and 415's door was ajar, warm light pooling onto the scuffed linoleum and the smell of something like oranges and dust drifting out, and for a second I saw the suggestion of a person moving just beyond the threshold, a sliver of a shoulder, the curve of a cheek, a yellow scarf. I blinked and it was only shadow. The light snapped off. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "You're early." I didn't move. The hall hummed with the building's tired electricity. Behind me my taped drawings rustled in a breeze from nowhere. Who are you? I texted, because curiosity always wins the coin toss against fear. The typing bubble appeared, vanished, returned, as if whoever was on the other end had to pick a name from a pile. Then, you told me not to say yet. I stared until my eye stung. The neighbor's kid bounded up the stairs, 2 at a time, and handed me a fresh drawing he must have finished on the landing. In it, I was asleep on my couch, and someone stood over me with their head bowed like they were listening to my dream, and in the corner of the drawing, in blue crayon, the kid had written a single instruction that made the air thin out until my lungs forgot how to be useful. Whatever happens, don't lock the door tonight. I stared at the blue crayon command until the letters felt like a dare and the apartment felt like a mouth that might swallow me if I blinked, and the stupidest part was that a 6-year-old with grass knees now dictated my home security. Still, when midnight rolled over the city like a heavy blanket, I stood at the door with my hand on the deadbolt and argued with myself out loud like a man auditioning for insanity. Then I slid the bolt back and left it, against every instinct, against every true crime podcast saved my life anecdote unlocked. I taped the kids' drawings along the wall by the couch like talismans, set my phone face down, killed all the lamps except the one by the kitchen that makes everything look softer than it is, and lay there pretending to watch a documentary I didn't press play on while my building exhaled its old pipes and someone upstairs practiced the same wrong piano chord 3 times. At 2:58 my eyes finally graveled shut and I thought, fine, universe, do your worst. And at 3:17 exactly, the number people online swear is when the world forgets its manners, the latch moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done it before and the door breathed open an inch, then 2, the hall school air sliding in along the floor like a scout. I didn't sit up because the last drawing told me I wouldn't, so I let my body mimic the sketch of me sleeping, breath slow, arm across my stomach, and I listened as footsteps crossed the threshold and paused at the coat rack as if to hang back a century. A scent came first, not cologne, not smoke, citrus and dryer sheets, oranges and fabric softener, a smell that belonged to no one I knew but felt like a memory I'd borrowed. The figure stood over me, close enough that the couch cushion dipped a fraction with their weight on the edge, close enough that when they breathed I could feel the smallest warm draft against my temple, and a voice, barely there, a thread pulled through a needle, said my name very softly like they were afraid the syllables would break. Then, this part is the worst, almost apologetically, like we were in a mutually agreed upon nightmare. A paper slid under my hand, the lightest whisper of copy paper against skin, and I forced my fingers not to close around it because the drawing showed my hands slack, and the voice said, you told me to say as little as possible, you said I always talk too much, and that's when my scalp prickled because that was exactly the sort of jab I make it myself when I accidentally monologue in texts, the small self-loathing humor nobody else hears unless they live inside my head. I couldn't help it, I opened my eyes, fast, a reflex like yanking your hand from a hot stove, and for a fraction of a second I saw a face that wasn't a stranger's, not exactly older, not exactly different. More like the idea of my face 2 years from now if I slept badly and worried too much, and the shock of recognizing the cadence in that breath, the way the left eyebrow lifts when calculating a lie, almost made me gasp. The figure flinched like I'd fired a starting pistol and stepped back into the hall shadow where the light from the forever vacant 4 to 15 pulled under the door, and in the half-light I saw the edge of a yellow scarf flick as the body turned, the same scarf from the bus stop drawing, the same punctuation mark my life keeps dodging. Don't go to work tomorrow. The voice said from the doorway, stronger now, more like mine, and if the fire alarm goes off in the afternoon, leave it, do not go back for anything, especially not the photo album, you'll want to, but you promised me you wouldn't, and the way they emphasized promise me made my throat go dry because that's exactly how I negotiate with myself. Guilt first, I pushed up on an elbow despite the drawing, despite the deal, and the figure was already retreating, 1 foot, then the other, and I blurted, not even a question but a plea, who are you, and the typing bubble of a pause happened in the doorway, the kind of breath you take before jumping into cold water, and they said, you told me not to answer that yet, and then they were gone and the door was breathing shut and the hall was only electricity and old plaster again. My hand finally moved and closed over the paper like it had been magnetized, and on it there were 3 things in my own blocky caps, a list of times, 9:42, 1:13, 4:05, with single word notes beside them, call, alarm, stairs, a bus. Ticket receipt for tomorrow morning to a part of town I never visit with a bench circled in pen, and at the bottom where a signature would go, 2 dashes and 1 word, me. I sat there until the light in the kitchen turned the room the color of waiting rooms, and at 9:41 precisely my phone buzzed and the unknown number called and the kid's drawing said don't answer and I didn't, and 1 minute later a voicemail transcribed itself with a message from my boss saying the ceiling tiles over my station had finally given up and the sprinkler maintenance guys were on their way. Could I come in late? And at 1:13 an alarm went off in my building, not a fire alarm, the other one, the one that whines when the pressure in the old boiler spikes, and Diego texted me a meme at the same minute for no reason at all like the universe was keeping time. And at 4:05 exactly the building's actual fire alarm screamed and I stood in my doorway with my keys in my hand and looked at the corner where the photo album sits, the one with the few pictures I actually like of myself, the ones with my dad's arm around my shoulders before he got sick, the only proof some days that he once looked at me like I wasn't a disappointment, and I physically felt myself start to turn toward it like a tide. Then I looked at the paper and at the kid's blue crayon commandment and at my unlocked door, and I made the ugliest sound I've ever made and fled down the stairs empty-handed with smoke licking the ceiling like a hungry cat, on the street, coughing, surrounded by neighbors in pajamas and the teenage sister who never looks impressed actually crying into her sleeve. I saw the woman in the yellow scarf across the street with a stroller that held no baby, just the idea of one, watching me like I was the experiment and she taking notes, and she lifted 2 fingers in a halfwave that translated to hold and I did, because my knees were water. Later the firefighters said it was a miracle we lost power to one line, a small electrical fire behind the laundry on 2, no injuries because everyone evacuated promptly, and when I went back up through the stink my apartment door was open and the photo album was exactly where I'd left it and there was a new drawing on the floor just inside the threshold, slid under like a bill, and in it the kid had drawn me on the bench he'd drawn days ago with the woman in the yellow scarf beside me again, except this time he'd given her a face, not a detailed face, not eyes I could recognize, but a mouth that looked like mine when I'm trying not to say something, and in blue crayon he'd written, not a command this time but a question that made my skin feel like it didn't fit, ready to ask why you needed me to draw you? The paper shook in my hands because kids don't write riddles in blue crayon unless someone older has their hand on the crayon too, but when I asked him the next morning what he meant he just shrugged like the question was boring and said, "You told me you'd forget if I didn't remind you," and then he ran back inside before I could grab the thread. I walked home with the drawing and stared at the question until the words peeled off the page in my head and stuck to the ceiling like glow in the dark stars, and the more I thought about it the more I realized he was right. Forgetting things had become a skill. I forget where I put my keys, I forget appointments, I forget names, I forget the way my father's voice used to lift at the end of a joke, but now I wondered if maybe I'd been forgetting on purpose because remembering wasn't safe. At work I couldn't focus, the fire alarm smell still clinging to my hair, my boss making jokes about the building finally giving up, and I sat at my desk pretending to type while staring at the bus ticket receipt taped into the kid's drawing. After lunch I gave in and rode the bus to that part of town, a stretch of cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts, the kind of place where benches are less for resting and more for people who ran out of doors to sit behind. I sat on the exact bench circled in pen and waited, my hands tight on the strap of my bag like it might turn into something useful if things went wrong. At 4:11 a.m. shadow stretched over my shoes and I looked up to see the woman in the yellow scarf, her hair tucked back, eyes hidden behind sunglasses even though the sky was overcast, and she sat beside me without asking if the seat was free. "You weren't supposed to be early," she said softly, like we were picking up an argument from yesterday. I swallowed and said, "Do I know you?" She smiled faintly, not kindly. "Not yet. But you told me to tell you this, stop trying to catch me. Start listening." My chest tightened like I'd swallowed gravel. "Listening to what?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead she slipped a folded page into my palm, the paper already worn like it had been in someone's pocket for hours, and then she stood and walked away so casually she could have been leaving a dentist appointment. I opened the page and felt my knees weaken. It was a drawing, but not the kid's. This was done in pen, meticulous lines, older hands. It showed me at my desk at work, staring at my computer, and on the screen was a document titled Test Number 14, Subject Remembers Partial, and beneath it a line, Reminder delivered via child medium successful. I shoved the paper into my bag and almost ran home. I taped it next to the others, the crayon chaos colliding with the clinical pen strokes, and stared at the wall until my eyes watered. If this was real then someone, me? Another me? Was using a kid and a stranger in a scarf to keep me on a path, nudging me with pictures because plain words would fade or be ignored. The idea rooted in my head like ivy. What if I was part of some experiment, not supernatural but manufactured, memory reset and refed through drawings until I followed instructions without understanding why? At 8:03 my phone buzzed again with the unknown number. This time it didn't just say my name. It said, "Check the back of the album." I hadn't touched the album since the fire, afraid even to glance at it because I'd almost broken the promise, but now I dragged it out from the shelf and flipped it over, and taped to the cardboard was a small envelope sealed with red wax. My hands shook as I cracked it open, expecting ashes, expecting nothing, but instead there was a Polaroid me, unmistakably me, sitting on the same bus bench I had just left, except in the picture I was laughing with the woman in the yellow scarf, and on the back of the photo in jagged handwriting it said, "Proof that you listen. Next, you have to remember why." The note felt like a dare taped to my skull. Remember why. Why what? Why had I been shoved from my own timeline like a bookmark someone else decided to rip out? I sat on the floor with the album open like it might cough up the rest of the story if I looked hard enough. The Polaroid surface was warm from where I'd held it too long. The image inside it had that washed-out quality of a memory you don't trust anymore. Me laughing on the bench with the woman in the yellow scarf, except I couldn't remember laughing with anyone in months. The memory in the photo was too clean. Too staged. I felt like a ghost who had been given proof that he once sat inside his own life. The kid's drawing sat around me like ritual teeth, and outside the hallway hummed with the building doing what old buildings do, pipes complaining, a neighbor's radio sneaking a Bruce Springsteen line into the night. I could have waited, phoned someone, called the anonymous number back and begged for a manual, but curiosity has always been the mortar in the brickwork of my decisions. I made a list, kid to check, Polaroid check, yellow scarf woman check. The woman was the only one I hadn't touched. I could have stalked benches like a lunatic, asked bus drivers for CCTV, or I could start smaller and visit the kid's mother. The kid's mom, Tina, worked nights at the ER, which explained why the kid sometimes looked like he'd slept in crayon. I knocked on her door at 11, nerves doing that jittery thing they do when you try to be brave. She opened in a scrubbed shirt, hair in a hasty bun, her face surprised and tired. I showed her the drawings and the Polaroid like a man showing a dentist a cracked tooth. "He draws people I don't know," I said. "And sometimes he draws me doing things I haven't done." She blinked, one of those small, human blinks that says someone has been up too long. "He's weirdly specific sometimes," she admitted, inviting me in as if bad news needed tea. "He draws who I tell him to, sure, but mostly he draws whatever he dreams about. He has an active imagination." I pushed. "Has anyone asked him to draw things before? Older people? Strangers?" Tina's flinch was instant. "There was a man once. Wore a navy coat. Came a few times. Paid cash. Asked the kid to draw people in times and she stopped, because saying the words out loud chews the edges off secrets. He paid for crayons and pizza. I didn't think kids do weird projects, you know?" Her voice went small. "I didn't ask too many questions. I'm naive." She gave me a name though, an address where the man said he worked. A mental health clinic. A name nobody glamorous would ever claim, Mnemosyne Institute. It had the right mix of pretension and quiet menace that sits behind a locked door. The next morning I walked to the address she'd given me like a man walking to his own reckoning. The building looked like a bad idea in brick, beige, 2 stories, a sign that said Mnemosyne Behavioral Studies in tasteful serif. I expected cameras, a receptionist with a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, maybe a plaque with accolades. Instead I found taped flyers, volunteer opportunities, compensation provided, and a waxed lobby with an unplugged fish tank. The receptionist, smiling, too quick, asked me why I was there. I lied. I said someone in my building had told me they ran memory workshops and that I might be interested. She gave me a brochure very fast and then asked me to leave my contact. I left with a brochure I didn't read until I was 3 blocks away. It said things like, innovative memory modulation trials, pediatric medium delivery protocols, consented recollection aids. There were terms that made my stomach queasy, a list of jargon that sits between progressive medicine and something that ought to be illegal. I couldn't shake the image of the typed headerite seen in the pen-drawn sheet. Test number 14, subject remembers partial. If this was a clinic doing legal therapy, why use a kid to deliver reminders? If it was illegal, why plaster consent on glossy paper? I started asking around. People on forums were careful, like moths dancing around a flame. One poster, anonymously brave, said Mnemosyne had a history, grants, partnerships, a lot of papers about non-invasive cueing funded by a Shell Foundation. Another mentioned vans that arrived at night and technicians with clipboards. I couldn't do much internet digging without feeling like someone else might already be watching my tabs, so I went physical. Back at the building, a janitor smoking behind a dumpster, soft-eyed, 60-plus, cursed when I asked him about night shifts. He knew the vans. They come at midnight, he said, voice the kind you hear when people have decided not to hope. Clean-up crews, mostly. The kind that leave the lights on and don't answer to an office. You don't want to get involved, son. I wanted to slap him and hug him in the same heartbeat. Instead I did what cowardice sometimes admires as bravery. I asked for the evening schedule name scribbled on his clipboard. He hesitated and, with the conspiratorial air of someone who's been tolerated by more powerful people for years, he slid the page across the rusted metal. There it was, test number 14 again, scribbled next to a time that matched one of the drawings, 113. Subject, redacted. Handler, Dr. L. Monroe. I looked closer until the names blurred into a smear. I took a photo like a thief and walked away with that single scrape of paper burning my pocket. That night I couldn't sleep. My head buzzed with syllables, subject, handler, delivery, child medium. I imagined rooms with soft lights where people sat in chairs and someone fed a word through the door like a coin. I imagined myself on the other side of a screen, looking at a file with my name blacked out, a life rewritten by someone with a pencil. The next morning I drove to the address on the brochure for the photo lab that developed the Polaroid, the tiny imprint on the corner of the white border, lab, Meridian Imaging, Unit 4B. The owner, older woman, kind but sharp, checked her records. We do a lot of institutional work, she said. Some places want anonymity. But yes. That print came through last month. Paid in cash. Came from a courier who said it was for research proof. Her hand rested on a stack of invoices and, on the last page, a delivery slip with a partial license plate scrawled across it. I memorized the number. It was enough to put me on a path where people moved faster than I'd be comfortable with. I started to remember foggy flashes, an emergency room full of white after Dad's funeral, a nurse asking about past trials, a man with gentle hands explaining things like, we can help you forget the worst so you can live. My chest tightened. What if I'd been the one who signed away my memory? What if the thing I was supposed to remember, what I'd been told to remember why for, was the reason I'd once begged to forget? The thought landed inside me like an avalanche. I was chasing a truth that might undo me. But the Polaroid sat on my kitchen table, and the kid's blue crayon handwriting demanded it. Remember why. Whoever me was for those 2 dashes at the bottom of the paper, they were waiting for me to decide whether I wanted to know. I wanted to know too badly to stop. I wanted to know in the way an addict wants the next high, terrible and certain, and so I called the number on the delivery slip, hands steady with dread. A voice picked up after 3 rings, neutral, practiced. Meridian Imaging, it said. I swallowed. I need to know who used you last month. I need a plate number. The voice hesitated, just a fraction, and then said, you don't want to go down that road. The line clicked dead. I imagined Dr. Ella Monroe's face, sterile and kind, and I realized the only way forward was through a door no one would open for me willingly. I made a plan. Tomorrow I would park by the clinic at midnight and watch the vans. Tomorrow I would learn who me really was. Tomorrow I would ask the kid for the rest of his crayons and refuse to let the drawing stop being useful. Remember why. The phrase had become a map with a blinking arrow. I was going to follow it until it led me into whatever room had rearranged my past. I parked 2 blocks away in the kind of spot where the street lamp has been dead for years and the asphalt is cracked like old skin, and I sat there with the windows down just enough to hear if tires crunched on gravel, my stomach wired with the jittery static of caffeine and paranoia, the kid's latest drawing folded in my jacket pocket like a permission slip from someone I wasn't sure I trusted. Midnight came slow and then suddenly, it always does, and at 12:07 a.m. white van with no markings rolled up to the side lot of the Mnemosyne Institute, its headlights snapping off before it turned into the shadows, and 2 men climbed out in scrubs and reflective vests that looked official enough if you didn't look too long. They didn't smoke or chat or waste time, they unloaded crates the size of filing cabinets and wheeled them through the side door, and the building swallowed them without a sound. At 12:26 another van pulled up, this one with tinted windows and a faint dent in the bumper that made it look less like a fleet vehicle and more like something that had seen fights. A woman got out, clipboard in hand, white coat glowing in the dark like a beacon, and when she tilted her face toward the streetlight I caught the name from the janitor's clipboard, the handler, Dr. L. Monroe. She looked normal. That was the terrifying part. Normal in the way people who practice smiling become perfect at it. She signed off on the crates, exchanged words with the men I couldn't hear, then walked inside like she owned not just the building but the story behind it. I shifted in my seat, pulled out my phone, took grainy photos that would look like nothing to anyone who didn't already believe, and I wondered how many people had sat in my car before me trying to pull at the edges of Mnemosyne's curtain. At 1:13, the same number that had haunted the kid's drawing, the building's second floor flickered with light, not steady fluorescent but pulsing, like a heartbeat projected on blinds. A shadow moved across it, someone in a chair, someone pacing, and my chest tightened because I recognized the tilt of the head, the nervous hunch. It looked like me. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, told myself paranoia had finally pulled a chair up to the front of my brain, but when I looked again the silhouette was gone and the blind stilled. At 1:25 the doors opened and the men rolled the crates back out, but lighter this time, as if whatever weight they'd carried in had been stripped out inside. One of them laughed and the sound was brittle in the night, the kind of laugh people use when they've just done something they're not proud of but will do again tomorrow. I wanted to follow the van when it pulled out but my own hands wouldn't start the engine, like some part of me understood that chasing would end in a ditch. Instead I waited until the last taillight bled into the dark, then climbed out of the car and walked to the side door, every nerve screaming. The lock was standard, the kind a practiced thief could flick open with a card, and I am not a practiced thief but adrenaline makes you creative. I slipped my old library card in the frame and jiggled until the door side opened, and the smell inside hit me, antiseptic and dust, that hospital tang you can't mistake. The hall was empty, the walls lined with motivational posters about memory health, and the only sound was the distant whir of machines upstairs. I should have left. Instead I followed the sound. The stairwell was metal and loud under my weight, but no one came. On the second floor the hallway was darker, lined with numbered doors, each with a small slot like a mail chute. I passed 12, 13, 14. 14's light was still on under the crack, pulsing faintly. I bent down, heart pounding, and peered through the slot. What I saw made the floor tilt under me. A room with no furniture except a chair bolted to the ground. Electrodes taped to the head of a man slumped forward, his hair sticking up from sweat. A screen on the wall displayed scrolling text, subject resists recall. Administer secondary cue. The man lifted his head as if pulled by strings, and for a split second his face tilted toward me. My face. Not a twin, not a lookalike, me. My own mouth, my own tired eyes, staring at the slot like he knew I'd be there. My breath froze. Then Dr. Monroe stepped into frame, tapped a pen against the screen, and everything went dark. I stumbled back, hit the wall, and the sound echoed too loud, and I ran down the stairs, out the door, into the night where the air felt like knives. I drove home with my pulse trying to claw out of my chest, parched crooked, staggered into my apartment. On the wall the kid's drawings fluttered in a draft from the vent, and the newest one, the one he'd handed me that morning, showed me peering into a slot in a door marked 14, eyes wide, mouth open, and behind me in the drawing was a shadow of myself looking over my own shoulder. I dropped to the couch and stared until the paper blurred. I had proof. I had nothing. I had a memory of myself I didn't trust and a copy of myself I wasn't supposed to see. And written in blue crayon at the bottom of the drawing, in letters pressed so hard they tore the page, were 3 words, "Do not forget." I didn't sleep. I slid between the couch cushions and stared at the drawings until the sun crawled in like an apology and my phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. You saw him. Good. Don't slow down now. For a second I thought about burning the drawings, the Polaroids, the kid, anything to get a clean line through the whole mess, but the part of me that had always fixed things with duct tape and hope refused to let go. If there was a version of me strapped into a chair in a fluorescent room, then someone had been doing something to my head. Someone had been erasing, cueing, and stitching memories back like they were patching a coat. That is an image that will not let you be a bystander. I called Diego, voice thick, and told him everything in pieces, the vans, the crates, the slot, the face that looked back like a reflection with a different life. He swore and then said 3 words I hung on, bring evidence now. We didn't talk about the morality of breaking into a clinic, we only discussed what would fit in a backpack. At noon I went back to Mnemosyne with Diego, who had the expression of a man who'd watched too many courtroom dramas and decided he preferred to be in the part where the hero does something reckless. We parked 2 blocks over and walked, trying to look like guys meeting for coffee. The building sat patient, all beige and polite. The receptionist blinked at us like she'd memorized faces and never emotions. I lied smoothly, I was a concerned neighbor, worried about experiments. Diego pretended to be an IT guy there to run a security audit. She hesitated, looked at the brochure I'd shoved in my jacket, and then, to my shock, pressed a button under the desk and said, in a tone that suggested she wanted this to happen, Dr. Monroe is with a client. Please wait. The waiting room smelled like lemon sanitizer and 2 clean nerves. A man with severe hair and a cardigan flipped through a magazine he did not read. A small boy watched cartoons on a tablet too loud. My hands wanted to shake but didn't. After a while Dr. Monroe emerged, smiled, practiced, and I felt the same odd familiarity in her air as the woman at the bench. There's a charisma to people who erase things for a living, like they understand how to make you forgive them before you know you need it. Diego stepped forward like he had credentials, name-dropping nonprofits, and regulatory oversight, and that's when I saw movement, a technician at the back, a door labeled Observation Suite 2/Test 14. My stomach turned sour. I didn't get to watch any hands move slow, instincts are messy and loud. I slipped away toward the corridor as if to the bathroom and found the slot in room 14 again, but this time the door was slightly ajar and light spilled like confession. I shouldn't have. I shoved the door wider and peered in. The chair was empty. The screens were dark. On the table, a clipboard lay open with a page that made my throat close. Subject, number 4892 notes. Subject shows increased recall when prompted via child-mediated cues. Handler, Monroe. Administered, 01/12/03/29. The name had a trailing note, consent obtained via Guardian proxy, see file sealed. A file sealed. A Guardian proxy. My heart stomped. I took a photo because photos are proof and proof is comfort. The sound behind me was not a footstep but a door sliding closed, too smooth to be coincidence. I turned to see Dr. Monroe, face composed, and behind her a young man in a navy coat I'd seen at the bus stop months before. He smiled like an apology. You shouldn't be here, he said, voice low. He moved closer but not aggressively. We help people, Monroe continued, soothing as if she were mid-session. We enable those with traumatic blocks to lead functional lives. Sometimes methods are unconventional, child-mediated prompts, non-invasive cues. Always with consent. My jaw trembled. Consent? I asked. Who signed for me? She tilted her head, the practiced pity softening her features. You did, once. Or someone did on your behalf when you were not able. The world narrowed to a pinprick. I remembered a hospital bed, hands, a voice offering relief that felt like a promise to stop hurting. The idea that I, or someone for me, had signed away memory like paperwork in a waiting room made me want to vomit and laugh in equal measure. The young man, Matt? No, Different reached out and placed a hand on the clipboard as if to close the distance between explanation and me. We can help you, again, he said. We can make the uncertainty go away. That is the most dangerous sentence a benevolent monster can say. I thought of the man in the chair who looked like me. I thought of Anna's being told not to go back for things and the fire and the kids and the bench. I snatched the clipboard and tore the seal off the file. The papers inside were dense consent forms with signatures I didn't recognize, session notes redacted into rectangles, a schedule that matched the kids' drawings down to the minute. A name repeated like a brand, Project Mnemosyne Remediation Protocol. My blood turned cold and, somehow, a strange anger came rising up that didn't wait for deliberation. You lied, I said, and it sounded like an accusation and a benediction. Dr. Monroe's eyes sharpened. We did what we had to, she said. We gave you a life without the weight. It's my life, I said. You don't get to edit it. The man in the navy coat and administrator stepped forward. We have authorization, he said, and the security cameras in the hallway clicked to life like beetles, recording everything. The room closed in with staff appearing doorways like magicians producing doves. Diego pressed the phone to his ear and called a reporter. The man in the cardigan mouthed something to him, probably a warning. In seconds the polite clinic was a stage, people clustering, making statements. And then the thing I feared most, the doors locked automatically and alarms purred low. You shouldn't have taken those photos, Monroe said quietly. You shouldn't have come back. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to us, not hostile exactly, but like a jury learning the defendant's confession. I realized then that this was never going to be an argument about ethics in a boardroom. This was a fight over control, over who gets to keep memory, pain, and narrative. If I wanted the truth to live outside their sealed files, I'd have to trade whatever safety I still owned for it. My phone buzzed, another text from the unknown number. Good. Now burn the envelope in the sink. Then come back for test 15 tonight. The sky slid gray outside the clinic window and my mouth tasted like metal. I had the file, the photos, and the shape of a life that might have been stolen. I had a choice, run with this and become someone pursued, or stay and try to tear a hole big enough in their operation that light could get through. My hands felt raw but steady. I folded the clipboard into my jacket like something that might be evidence or a flag and said, we're going public. Dr. Monroe smiled, and this time it was not a practiced kindness but the calm of someone who knows how the next scene plays out. I'm sure you think you are, she said. But do you understand the consequences? I didn't. I didn't care. For the first time in weeks I felt something like resolve. Diego's hand found mine and squeezed. We walked out of the clinic into a night that smelled like rain and electricity, and the vans waited, as if they had been expecting us to choose. We didn't make it 2 blocks before Diego said we were being followed, and I didn't need him to point. The same dented bumper van from the night before was in the mirror, headlights too patient, not the jitter of someone just going the same way home. I told him to turn, he turned, they turned. By the third corner my throat was salt. I wanted to believe paranoia, but the clipboard digging into my ribs reminded me paranoia had been right too many times already. Diego pulled into a gas station, bright lights buzzing like protection spells, and the van rolled past without slowing. We bought waters we didn't drink and stood by the snack aisle like fugitives pretending to compare chips. We need to go public fast, Diego said. Drop the photos online, leak the file, whatever. If we sit on this, we're dead meat. I wanted to agree. My phone buzzed before I could answer. Unknown number again, don't post. Not yet. Meet at the bench tomorrow, 4:11. Bring no one. I showed it to Diego and he swore like a man trying to ward off fate. They're playing you, he said. They're using your own breadcrumbs to keep you dancing. He was probably right. Still, the kids' drawings had been accurate down to the minute. The bench wasn't optional, it was gravitational. I spent the night in Diego's spare room because home felt like a paper wall, and every sound outside made me check the window. The file I'd taken sat on the floor like a live grenade. I flipped pages until words blurred, phrases like memory scaffolding, cue child for reintegration, test subject demonstrates partial compliance. Half the lines were blacked out, but one sentence wasn't, reintegration necessary before phase 2, subject must recall origin event willingly. Origin event. The phrase itched under my skin. What was so bad I begged to forget? Or so useful they forced me? My own handwriting was in the margins of one page, shaky, slanted, but mine. If you're reading this, you agreed. Don't back out now. I stared until the letters swam. Morning came too soon. I walked to the bench at 4:11 with the Polaroid in my pocket and my stomach sour. The woman in the yellow scarf was already there, sitting like she owned the concrete, scarf glowing in the weak sun. She looked at me like someone looks at a friend they've rehearsed 1,000 conversations with. You weren't supposed to see room 14 yet, she said. But maybe it's better. Faster. My voice cracked. Who was in the chair? Her eyes softened, not with pity but with recognition. You. Or the you that stayed. We split you because you couldn't carry both loads. One to live, one to remember. My knees wanted to fold. Split? That's not possible. She smiled thinly. Memory makes possible what physics won't. They hollowed you out and left part of you behind. He's the container. You're the spill. She pressed an envelope into my hand, heavy with something stiff inside. You asked me to give you this when you started asking why. Don't open it until you're sure. I almost ripped it open right there, but she shook her head sharply, like she'd seen that future and it wasn't survivable. Wait, she said. Tonight. After the alarm. I wanted to scream, to demand straight answers instead of riddles, but behind her the kid was standing on the corner, holding up a new drawing. This one showed me at my own kitchen table again, the envelope in my hands, and behind me, drawn in blue crayon thick as veins, stood a second figure that looked like me but taller, heavier, darker around the eyes, watching. The kid dropped the drawing on the sidewalk and ran, not toward home but away, like he knew staying too close to me was dangerous. I bent to pick it up and my fingers shook so hard I almost tore the page. The scarf woman put a hand on my shoulder, grounding and terrifying. Tonight, she repeated. You'll remember why. Then she left like she always did, too calmly for someone detonating my life. I sat there until the sun dipped and the shadows of the buildings made the bench feel like a stage. In my pocket the envelope pulsed like a heartbeat, and all I could think was that maybe I'd been the one who signed the consent form, maybe I was the one who asked to be split, and if that was true then opening the envelope meant restitching two selves I wasn't sure could live in one body. I walked home with the drawing clutched so tight the paper sweated. The hall smelled of smoke again, faint but real, like a rehearsal. At 8:17 my phone buzzed, don't be late. Alarm at 10:03. After that, open it. I poured a drink I didn't finish, sat at the kitchen table with the envelope, and waited for the sound that would tell me which version of me was supposed to survive. I sat at the table like a defendant, the envelope in front of me like Exhibit A, the kid's drawing taped on the wall above it with that second me looming in blue crayon, and every minute closer to 10:03 made my skin feel tighter, like I was a balloon someone kept pumping air into. I didn't know if I wanted the alarm to come or to fail. At 9:58 my phone buzzed, unknown number again, just the word steady. At 10:02 the building groaned and then the siren shrieked, not fire this time but the evacuation alarm they test once a year, except it wasn't on the calendar. My neighbors opened doors, muttered curses, shuffled kids into stairwells. I sat still, staring at the envelope, because I knew this wasn't about safety regulations, it was about timing. At 10:03 exactly the alarm cut, and the silence after was worse than the noise, like the world had been vacuum sealed. My hands tore the flat before my brain could veto, and inside was not a letter but 3 Polaroids, each with my face but not my life. The first showed me in a hospital gown, for taped to my arm, eyes swollen from crying. The second showed me sitting in a sterile office across from Dr. Monroe, pen in hand, signature on a form labeled Memory Remediation Consent, Guardian Proxy. The third showed me in the chair in room 14, electrodes on my skull, mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear. On the back of the last Polaroid, scrawled in the same jagged hand as before, you begged us to do it. You wanted the pain gone. Remember why. My stomach lurched. I slammed the photos face down like they might infect me, but the images were already printed inside my head. If that was me, then I hadn't been a victim, I'd been a volunteer. A volunteer who somehow split into two, one to suffer and one to live. I staggered to the bathroom and vomited until bile burned my throat. When I looked up, my reflection in the mirror didn't feel like mine. My phone buzzed again, now you understand. Next step at 3:17. Don't be alone. I laughed bitterly because being alone had been the only rule I could control, and now even that was stolen. I called Diego, voice shredded, and told him to come. He arrived 20 minutes later, eyes wide at the Polaroid spread on the table. So you asked for this, he whispered. You let them erase you? I shook my head. I don't remember wanting this. But maybe that's the point. He didn't argue. He just sat with me, silent, the way you do when someone is unwrapping a wound. At 3:15 the building was quiet except for our breathing. At 3:17 exactly the door to 4-15 across the hall creaked open, the vacant apartment spilling warm light again. A figure stepped out me, but not me. The same face, older around the eyes, shoulders heavier, a presence that made my chest seize. He carried himself like a man who had been through war and hadn't left it. Finally, he said, voice rougher than mine. Diego swore under his breath. What the F, but the other me ignored him, focused on me with an intensity that pinned me to the couch. You split me to survive, he said. I held the memories so you could breathe. But they're breaking down. They can't hold us separate forever. He stepped closer, the light from the vacant unit stretching shadows across his face until it looked like two people flickering. You wanted to forget. You begged. But forgetting doesn't erase, it only delays. And now we have to choose, stay divided and rot, or remember everything and pay the price. My mouth was dry. What happens if I remember? He smiled, and it wasn't kind. Then you finally know why you needed mnemosiny. Why you asked to burn yourself down. He dropped something on the table, a new Polaroid, still warm from developing. It showed me, both versions, standing side by side with the kid in the middle, holding up another drawing. On the back, in blue crayon, next time, we're one. And before I could blink, the other me stepped back into 4-15, the door clicked shut, and the light snapped off like it had never existed. The silence that followed was heavier than the alarm. Diego whispered, what the hell just happened? I didn't answer, because I finally understood the most terrifying part, the drawings weren't leading me to the truth. They were leading me to myself, and the part of me I tried to bury was done waiting underground. I woke with the taste of metal and memory in my mouth like I'd been chewing on a key all night, and the apartment felt different the moment my eyes opened, lighter and also unbearably full, like someone had turned up the volume on everything and left the dishes clattering. Diego was gone, his couch imprint cold, and the kids' drawings lined the wall like a jury. The Polaroid sat on the table, edges curling, and the blue crayon note that promised next time, where one stared at me with the same polite cruelty as the rest of the evidence. For a long time I just sat there, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't noticed I'd made, listening to the building warm up around me, pipes, distant footsteps, the faint radio from someone's car downstairs, until a memory uncoiled inside me like a rope. A hospital room, fluorescent light, someone holding my hand too firmly while a woman with calm eyes, Dr. Monroe, explained reconstruction, and a younger me nodding. The nodding had been automatic, desperate to stop the pain. I remembered being offered a ledger, choices inked in fine print, a voice saying this would let me live and let the other part keep what hurt. I remembered signing. The paper had felt like freedom until it didn't. The question that had been a puzzle now pressed at my throat. What had I been running from so hard I made a deal to forget? I could keep hiding in the fractured life they'd given me, let one half carry the load and the other half pretend to be whole, or I could go back to room 14 and demand whatever remained be returned in full, consequences and all. I was still thinking it through when the kid arrived on the stoop, hair wild, clutching a fresh drawing like contraband. He walked in without knocking like he had always been allowed, dropped the paper on the table, and peered at me like I was both the answer and a question. The drawing was simple, me at the clinic signing a form, and beside me, in the margins, a tiny stick figure scribble of the woman in the yellow scarf handing me a Polaroid. Underneath, in the kid's blunt block letters, you wanted to forget because you saw him die. The room tightened. I read the line again, once, twice, like I was translating a language I'd been avoiding. Die. The word remade the air. I remember flashes, the smell of antiseptic, a monitor beeping, a hand that might have been mine or might have been someone else's pushing something away. For the first time the pieces made an ugly picture, not just trauma, but a choice made in the rawest terms: erase the memory of someone's death and keep living, or keep the memory and carry a grief that would break you. The doorbell rang then, hard and urgent. I set the drawing down and opened the door to find the woman in the yellow scarf and, behind her, two men in suits I didn't recognize. Her face was hollow-edged but furious. We don't have time for riddles, she said without preamble. They're moving fast. Hale's people are scrambling to clean up loose ends since the raid. Monroe's getting nervous. We have to get you somewhere safe and get everything out. Her hands were steady in a way I'd never seen before. She moved like someone who'd rehearsed rescue scenes in 1,000 mirrorless rooms. I should have run with her, let the legal and moral dominoes fall where they would, but something in me, some stubborn, stupid strand of ownership, wanted the truth to be mine, not packaged by strangers. What if I don't want to be fixed? I asked. What if I want to remember and be destroyed? Her eyes softened. Then you'll remember what you asked to forget. You'll see who you were, and maybe you'll forgive him, or maybe you'll burn it all down. Either way, you'll be whole. The men in suits cleared their throats. One of them, an older man with a worn badge tucked into his inner pocket, showed me a laminated card. Federal organized crime. The arrest of Hale had woken things up in ways I hadn't imagined. There were people who wanted the protocol files and people who wanted them gone. We need those files out in public, he said. You have access. You remember more than you think. I thought of the sealed files, the red wax I'd cracked, the signatures that were both mine and not. I thought of the man in room 14 whose face reflected mine with the ricochet of trauma, and somewhere in my chest something like pity bloomed, not for Monroe or Hale or even myself, but for the person who had sat in that chair carrying what I had refused to carry every day. I made a choice that sounded less noble in my head than it felt. We would go to the clinic together. We would take the files, leak them, and make sure whatever grotesque trade had been made in the name of living had to answer to people who could not be bought. We moved like thieves at dawn. The clinic's lights were dim, the lobby abandoned, but the van from the night before idled anonymous in the lot. Dr. Monroe stepped out like she'd anticipated our arrival, her face a calm mask. You shouldn't have come, she said, but there was no venom, only tired resignation. The federal agent Tom, his card said, announced himself, and the place shifted from theater to crime scene. People who worked there were led into small rooms, cameras were requisitioned, and files were boxed. I watched Monroe's hands as she signed things, as she handed over admission logs and payment slips and that sealed Guardian proxy file I'd torn open. She didn't look at me when she did it. She looked at the floor like a woman who'd been asked to account for a life she'd altered. Then, in a motion that made my stomach flip, the agent placed a man in handcuffs, the Navy code admin who'd smiled like an apology. He cursed and spat and then, quieter, asked for me. You, he said. You were supposed to be the controlled subject. You were supposed to accept the remediation and move on. Hearing it from him did something strange, it let anger in. I stepped forward. I wasn't a subject, I said. I was a person who was told forgetting was an option. I asked for help because something died and it was easier than carrying it. The man's expression split like peeling paint. You don't know the ramifications, he hissed. Phase 2 as Tom cut him off with a look that smelled like paperwork in prison. Tell it to a judge, he said. The raid blurred into a flood of interviews, statements, and the hum of cameras. Files leaked to outlets that made monsters out of institutions and small heroes out of whistleblowers. But the real reckoning happened later, in the evidence room, when an agent put a Polaroid in front of me and asked me to name the moment. It was the same picture I'd seen in the envelope, but this time I didn't need to guess. I remembered, sharp as a glass shard, a hospital corridor, a man, my friend, or maybe a brother, maybe a lover bleeding in a room while machines screamed and I was asked to sign to forget. I remembered wanting to die with him so his death would feel like shared grief, and then the hollow relief of a consent form. The memory broke me open and, in the spilling, something else happened. The man from room 14, my other half, went quiet, then folded in like a page turning. The division didn't snap back clean, it stitched with scars and knotted threads, but I felt whole in a way that terrified me. I had asked for forgetting because I couldn't bear the weight. I had asked to survive. Now I had to live with what I had chosen. The agents told me they'd press charges, that the clinic's operations were likely criminal. The woman in the yellow scarf, her name finally spoken by someone who knew her beyond a test subject's note, walked up and simply said, "You did what you needed to do." I wanted to tell her that I'd been guided, that the kid's drawings had been an external will, but the truth sat on my tongue like a pebble. Instead I let the memory sit, raw and entire, and I looked at the Polaroids, some hellish proof, some salvation, and for the first time felt my life belonged to me, messy and dangerous and unbearably real. I thought the hard part would be the raid, the handcuffs, the news cameras, the feeling of strangers rifling through the life you've let yourself live for convenience, but the hard part was quieter, the way mornings stretched like old chewing gum and everything that used to fit into the shape of my days now had to be rearranged. The clinic's closure made headlines for a week. There were op-eds about the ethics of memory, about how money and novelty had wrapped themselves around human pain and called it progress. Dr. Monroe got a name in the paper, the Navy Code admin got arraigned, and the Mnemosyne Institute dissolved into subpoenas and apologies that never quite reached the people they'd rewritten. The federal agents were good at the police part, evidence, warrants, indictments, but the human part, the slow, knobby work of putting a life that had been edited back into readable sentences, fell to other people, therapists, advocates, and archivists who specialized in stolen histories. I started with therapy because there was no clean shortcut. The first session was a train wreck of silence and sobbing, and then, when my voice finally came back, it told the story like a drunk who'd been keeping secrets under his jacket, the hospital corridor, the pleading faces, the signature I had signed like I was signing away a piece of myself. My therapist, gentle, blunt, expensive, didn't say there. He said, "You made a choice under unbearable circumstances. Now you can choose again." That phrasing mattered, not because it absolved anything, but because it handed me a tiny tool I could use when the panic started, agency. The other part of the healing was public and ugly and necessary. We testified at hearings. I read pages from the sealed files in an appointed room with a court reporter watching, and the words sounded different when they left my mouth and landed in the world. Consent obtained via guardian proxy, child-mediated queuing protocols, phase 2 escalation potential untested. People gasped, some reporters sighed in satisfaction, some of my neighbors looked at me with new eyes, like they'd been watching a TV show where the main character finally gets his due. The yellow scarf woman, her name was Mara, didn't want to be a hero, but she became one in the press because she had a way of telling what was true without making it into a story about herself. She told investigators about networks of volunteers who'd refused to look away, about safe houses, about the small prosecutions that quieted larger predators. The kid, Tommy, ended up in a custody plan where his mother agreed to therapy and oversight. He had been exploited, indirectly, by a system that saw a child's imagination as a tool, that broke my heart even more than the idea of my own memory being bought and sold. We won a civil case against the clinic owners. They paid fines they could barely feel and sat in courtrooms that felt a little smaller than their private rooms. The criminal trials were messy, delayed, complicated by lawyers who loved the smell of a complicated ethical defense. Still, a handful of people who'd made careers out of erasing people's pasts went to prison. It wasn't enough to make everything right, but it made a dent in the ledger. Inside me, the integration was not cinematic. The other me didn't vanish with dramatic sound, instead, he folded into a life that suddenly had to hold more weight. Some mornings I woke with a full chest of memories, terrible, luminous, clear, and sometimes I woke with the blankness I had paid for, and both things terrified me. My therapist taught me grounding techniques, how to name the room, how to touch a table and remind my body it was safe. I learned to let myself feel guilt and anger without letting them run the show. I learned to set boundaries with people who wanted me to be the hero in their narratives. Anna visited. We had conversations that looked like small, terrible stitches. She told me about the men Matt had been with, about the nights she'd slept in bus stations and the day she'd wrapped Oliver and walked until her legs hurt. She told me she'd almost let someone else adopt Oliver because keeping him felt like a target, and I told her that the times I'd wanted simpler lives weren't cowardice but survival. We didn't solve a decade in a weekend. We ate bad diner pancakes and argued about whether Oliver's laugh sounded more like me or more like Anna, and the little things made up for the horrors in ways the news never could. The Polaroids live in a box now, along with filed affidavits and a journal I started writing when the nights were loud. Sometimes I look at that box and think about the person I was before room 14, frightened, willing to trade memory for ease, and I don't like him, but I don't want to erase him either. I show the box to people who need to believe that institutions can be held accountable, and I hide it when the days are too bright and I'm not ready to be a museum. The kids' drawings, those weird, prescient things, are taped in a folder on my bookshelf. I don't know if Tommy was ever programmed or merely a conduit for a lot of people's bad decisions, but he drew me a map back to myself, and for that alone I owe him something like gratitude and something like a wariness I'll carry forever. The me in room 14, if you ask my therapist, he'll say we integrated him slowly through exposure and rituals and the small kindnesses of friends who refused to let me disappear. If you ask me, I'll say he taught me things I needed to know, that pain could be carried and witnessed, and that remembering didn't have to mean drowning. Years from the raids, when Mnemosyne is a case study in a textbook and the phones in my pocket ring with mundane things, scheduling a dentist appointment, a friend asking for a beer, I still flinch at alarms and I still sometimes see my own face across a glass and feel guilty for the time I asked to be less myself. But then Oliver runs by and calls me his uncle, or Anna texts a picture of him asleep with his mouth open in a ridiculous way, and I fold that into the ledger too. At the end of the day, the story everyone wants is the one where justice is delivered and the protagonist rides off into a stable sunrise. Life isn't like that for most of us. My life is a series of stitches, some crooked, some holding, and a few shiny new threads that make me laugh when I catch sight of them. I don't have a neat ending, but I have a choice each morning now that I didn't have before. I can remember, I can grieve, and then I can step outside and try again. That's enough for now.